The rain hammered the city like a relentless drum, each drop rattling against windows and bouncing off the slick pavement. Thunder cracked overhead, sending tremors through the darkened streets. It was the kind of night that made people hurry home, seeking warmth and safety. But inside La Fortaleza, a small but renowned restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of town, the storm outside was the least of their worries. The restaurant was minutes from closing. A few remaining customers lingered over their meals, enjoying the cozy ambiance while the staff tidied up. Miguel, the assistant chef, hummed to himself as he stacked dishes. Behind the counter, Daniel Costa wiped his hands on a towel, his gaze drifting toward the large front windows. Something gnawed at him, a quiet unease, like an itch beneath the skin. Then, the door burst open. 5 masked men rushed in, their presence a violent intrusion against the restaurant's peaceful atmosphere. Guns gleamed under the dim lighting, and a deep voice barked out orders. "Everybody stay where you are. Hands up!" a woman shrieked. Chairs scraped against the floor. The soft melody playing through the speakers was drowned by chaos. Daniel remained still. His eyes scanned the room, cataloging every detail. The leader, tall, broad, controlled, was the one giving orders. The others, nervous and jittery, clutched their weapons too tightly. Amateurs. Dangerous but predictable. Miguel, frozen by fear, turned toward him. Only he knew the truth. Daniel wasn't just a chef. His past was hidden, locked away beneath years of restraint. But tonight, fate had other plans. The criminals had made one fatal mistake. They had chosen the wrong restaurant. The scent of garlic and simmering sauces still lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp aroma of freshly brewed espresso. La Fortaleza had nearly closed for the night, its once lively atmosphere now subdued as the last patrons finished their meals. Miguel wiped down the counter, humming softly, while Daniel stood near the kitchen entrance, arms crossed. It had been a quiet evening, until now. The masked intruders moved swiftly, their boots thudding against the polished wooden floor. The leader, a tall man in a dark jacket, surveyed the room with an air of authority. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Everyone, hands where I can see them. Do not move." A hush fell over the restaurant. The waitstaff, paralyzed with fear, obeyed instantly. A couple near the back clutched each other, their wide eyes darting between the assailants. Daniel stayed motionless, his expression unreadable. He felt Miguel's eyes on him, searching for guidance, but Daniel didn't move. Not yet. The robbers spread out. One of them, a lanky figure with a nervous energy, kicked over a chair. "Hurry up, man. We don't have all night." The leader, Victor as one of the men had muttered, lifted his gun slightly, a calculated threat. Everyone cooperates and no one gets hurt. This is simple. But nothing about this felt simple. Daniel's instincts flared, the disciplined part of his mind assessing every angle. The men were armed, but uncoordinated. Their masks concealed more than their faces. They hid inexperience, fear. Still, that made them unpredictable. He turned his gaze toward the restaurant's entrance. The neon open sign flickered against the glass, reflecting the distorted silhouettes of the intruders. Rain drummed outside, drowning out any distant city noise. No one was coming to help. A waiter, trembling, stammered, "Please, don't hurt anyone." Victor approached him, gripping the back of his shirt. "We're not here to hurt anyone, but if someone makes this difficult..." He tilted his gun toward the ceiling and pulled the trigger. A deafening bang split the air. People screamed. A woman ducked under a table, covering her ears. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the room. Daniel clenched his jaw. That single shot changed everything. The robbers had control now. Fear was their weapon. And yet Daniel felt no fear, only focus. Miguel inched closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Daniel, what do we do?" Daniel's fingers curled slightly, a silent signal to stay calm. He didn't answer. Not yet. Victor motioned toward the bar. "Cash. Now." One of his men, stockier than the rest, vaulted over the counter, shoving glasses aside. The bartender, hands shaking, fumbled with the register. Bills fluttered onto the polished surface. Another thief, his mask slightly askew, approached the customers. Wallets, jewelry, everything on the table. Daniel exhaled slowly. He needed more time, more information. Who was the weakest link? Who was the most dangerous? Victor turned his attention toward Daniel. "You, chef." His voice was almost casual, but there was an edge to it. "You run this place." Daniel met his gaze. "I cook." Victor smirked. "Good. Then you understand orders. Don't do anything stupid." Daniel didn't blink. Wouldn't dream of it. Victor nodded, satisfied. Smart man. He glanced at the others. Move faster. We're not staying here all night. One of the robbers near the kitchen hesitated as he passed a stack of knives. His fingers twitched before he moved on. Weak link. Daniel filed that away. The chaos continued. Money exchanged hands. Customers whimpered. The storm outside raged on, but Daniel was patient. He watched. He waited. And when the moment came, when the first crack in their plan revealed itself, he would act and they wouldn't see it coming. The air inside La Fortaleza had thickened with fear. Every breath felt heavy, every movement cautious. The robbers worked fast, gathering valuables while keeping their weapons raised. The customers and staff obeyed, their survival instincts overriding any thoughts of resistance. But Daniel wasn't like them. He had seen fear before, held it, molded it, used it. And he knew that these men, for all their bravado, were walking a thin line between control and disaster. Then Victor spoke again. 5 minutes, he warned, checking the time on his watch. No mistakes. The command was clear, but it wasn't just for his men, it was for everyone. A reminder that patience had limits. Daniel's gaze swept across the room, analyzing the robbers. The one at the bar, still stuffing cash into a duffel bag, was slow but methodical. The nervous one collecting wallets barely held his gun properly. The stocky man by the door, probably their enforcer, stood with squared shoulders ready to act at the first sign of trouble. And then there was Victor, calm, controlled, too comfortable with a gun in his hand. He wasn't just another thug. Daniel had known men like him before. Miguel, still beside him, shifted uncomfortably. Daniel didn't look, but he could sense his tension. The younger man wasn't built for this. His breathing had quickened, his hands twitched. One of the robbers noticed. Hey! The stocky one pointed his gun at Miguel. What's wrong with you? Miguel froze. Nothing. Victor's head turned sharply, eyes locking onto Miguel like a predator scenting weakness. He took a step closer. You look nervous, he said, voice deceptively smooth. You thinking of doing something stupid? Daniel spoke before Miguel could. He's just scared, he said evenly, like everyone else. Victor studied him, then exhaled through his nose, as if deciding the chef wasn't worth the trouble. Then he should stay quiet, he muttered, stepping back. Miguel swallowed hard. Daniel, without moving a muscle, memorized every detail of the interaction. Victor didn't like resistance. He thrived on control. That was his weakness. A sudden crash shattered the tense silence. One of the waiters, pale and shaking, had knocked over a tray of glasses. The sound echoed like an alarm. The nervous robber spun, gun shaking. What the hell was that? The waiter raised his hands, stammering. I didn't mean to. Victor moved fast. In a heartbeat, he was in front of the waiter, his gun pressed against the man's chest. The entire restaurant held its breath. Do I look like I care what you meant? Victor's voice was ice. The waiter whimpered, eyes wide with terror. Daniel's muscles coiled. The situation was about to spiral. Victor needed to establish dominance again. A warning, a lesson. Daniel had seconds to act. I'd reconsider, he said, his voice calm but firm. Victor turned his head slightly, one eyebrow raised. Reconsider what? Daniel held his gaze, unwavering. You shoot him. You make things messy. Noise draws attention. Attention gets people caught. He tilted his chin toward the front door. And right now you don't need problems, you need an exit. The tension was razor thin. Then Victor chuckled. You're smart, chef, he said, lowering his gun. He patted the waiter's shoulder almost mockingly. Lucky for you, I'm feeling generous. The waiter sagged in relief. Daniel, however, knew exactly what had just happened. He had drawn Victor's attention, and that meant Victor was now watching him. The criminals continued their looting, but now Daniel could feel Victor's eyes flickering toward him every few moments. He had just put himself on the leader's radar. That was dangerous. But maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed, because the more Victor focused on him, the less he would see what Daniel was truly preparing. Daniel remained still, his face unreadable. The tension inside La Fortaleza was suffocating, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories he had tried to bury. This wasn't the first time he had faced armed men. Long ago, in another life, he had worn a uniform. Not a chef's apron, but tactical gear. His hands had gripped not kitchen knives, but weapons designed to end lives. And now those hands itched again. Years ago, The desert sun had been merciless, beating down on Daniel's unit as they moved through the ruins of an abandoned village. The air was thick with dust and the scent of gunpowder. He could still hear the radio chatter, the distant echo of gunfire. "Stay sharp," his commander had warned. "They're watching." Daniel had been younger then, sharper, faster. He had believed in the mission, in the cause. His hands had been steady when they pulled the trigger. Then came the day everything changed. An ambush, screams, blood. He had been the last one standing, the only survivor. The mission had been classified, the details erased, but the images never left him. The weight of guilt had grown heavier with time. He had walked away, abandoning the soldier's life, vowing never to return to that darkness. Cooking had been his refuge, a way to create instead of destroy. But now, here he was again, surrounded by men with guns, forced to remember who he used to be. Miguel shifted beside him, bringing Daniel back to the present. Victor was watching him closely now, not just as a hostage, but as a possible threat. "You've been quiet, Chef," Victor said, stepping closer. Daniel met his gaze. "Nothing to say." Victor smirked. "People like you don't stay quiet in situations like this. I know a fighter when I see one." Daniel said nothing. He had learned long ago that words could be more dangerous than actions, but Victor wasn't done testing him. "You don't seem afraid," he mused. "I've seen fear before. It's in the eyes, in the hands." He gestured toward a trembling customer in the corner. "Like her." Then he pointed at Daniel. "But not you." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Maybe I've just seen worse." Victor's smirk widened. "I believe that." The leader studied him for another moment, then turned his attention back to his men. Daniel resisted the urge to flex his fingers. His body was already preparing itself for action. His instincts, long suppressed, were waking up. And now, he had confirmation of what he suspected. Victor was sharp, dangerous, but he was also arrogant. He thought he understood people, controlled them. Daniel had met men like him before, and he knew exactly how to take them down. The question was no longer if he would act. It was when. Daniel's muscles were coiled, ready. His mind, once dulled by years of quiet, had snapped back into focus. The restaurant, the robbers, the terrified customers. He saw everything with cold precision, but he couldn't act recklessly. A single mistake could get someone killed. Victor paced near the entrance, his gun lowered but always within reach. The others were spread out, one still at the register, another near the tables, and the stocky one watching the door like a guard dog. The nervous one, the weakest link, was the easiest target. Daniel's first move had to be subtle. "Chef," Miguel whispered. His voice was barely audible, his hands trembling at his sides. Daniel didn't look at him. Instead, he gave a small shake of his head. "Stay calm. Stay still." Miguel swallowed hard. A distraction was needed, something small but effective. He glanced toward the counter, where a stack of plates sat neatly by the espresso machine. Then, without a word, he moved. His steps were controlled, his motion fluid. He picked up a plate, pretending to fidget with it nervously. It was a risk. Too much movement could draw attention. The nervous robber turned toward him. "What are you doing?" His voice cracked slightly. Daniel widened his eyes, playing into the act. Just cleaning. Habit." The robber hesitated. He wasn't sure if this was a problem, but his nerves made him cautious. "Put it down." Daniel nodded, setting the plate back, but not before positioning it exactly where he wanted. A small setup. Now he needed the next step. The stocky man by the door turned his head slightly, distracted by movement outside. A car passed by, headlights flashing through the rain-soaked window. That was enough. Daniel acted. With a swift motion, he nudged the plate off the counter. It crashed to the floor, shattering. The sound, sharp and unexpected, made everyone flinch. The nervous robber spun toward the noise, exactly what Daniel wanted. In that split second, Daniel stepped forward. His hand moved fast, grabbing the gun barrel and twisting. The robber yelped in surprise as his wrist was forced into an unnatural angle. The weapon clattered onto the floor. Before anyone could react, Daniel drove his elbow into the man's gut. He folded instantly, breath knocked from his lungs. Miguel gasped, but Daniel didn't stop. He bent down, swiftly kicking the fallen gun under a nearby table out of reach. Now the room had shifted. Everyone had seen it. Victor turned, eyes flashing with anger. The other robbers tensed, realizing what had just happened. Daniel slowly straightened, his breathing even. His hands were loose at his sides, controlled. Victor's smirk was gone. "You made a mistake, Chef," he said, his voice dangerously low. Daniel didn't answer. He simply met Victor's gaze, waiting. The leader exhaled through his nose. "All right then," he said, nodding to his men. "Let's see what you really are." The tension snapped. The stocky man lunged. Daniel sidestepped, his movement smooth, effortless. He caught the attacker's wrist mid-swing, redirecting his momentum. In a flash, he twisted the arm back, locking it in place. A strangled grunt of pain, a moment of hesitation. That's all he needed. With practiced efficiency, Daniel swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining robbers hesitated. They weren't ready for this. Victor, however, was watching carefully. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he looked almost amused. "Interesting," Victor murmured. Daniel exhaled slowly. The first moves had been made, but this was far from over. For a moment, everything was still. The robbers stared at their fallen companion, processing what had just happened. The customers held their breath. Miguel's eyes darted between Daniel and the men, disbelief mixing with fear. Then the room exploded into motion. "Get him!" Victor's voice was sharp, a command laced with fury. The two remaining armed men rushed forward. Daniel moved first. The stocky man on the floor groaned, struggling to rise, but Daniel had already shifted his focus. His training took over. Efficiency over force. The first attacker swung wildly. Daniel ducked, his movements precise, sidestepping the reckless attack. In the same breath, he drove his fist into the man's ribs. A sharp grunt, a stumble. The second attacker hesitated for half a second, too long. Daniel grabbed a chair and swung it hard. Wood met flesh with a sickening crack. The man toppled backward, crashing into a table. Dishes shattered on impact. Screams erupted from the hostages. Victor, still standing near the entrance, exhaled slowly. Unlike his men, he didn't panic. He was watching, calculating. "Enough!" he barked, raising his gun. Everything froze. Daniel stopped mid-motion, his breathing controlled. He could feel the room's fear shift, tightening like a noose. Victor aimed directly at him. "You're fast," he said, voice calm despite the chaos. "Trained, not just some chef." Daniel remained silent. Victor's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. "That's a problem." The stocky man groaned, dragging himself to his feet, blood trickling from his lip. The man Daniel had hit with the chair struggled to rise. The tide was turning. Daniel had made his move. Now Victor had control again. The leader tilted his head slightly. "I could kill you right now," he mused, "but that would be too easy. You just changed the game, Chef. Now I need to adjust." He turned his gun toward the hostages. A woman whimpered. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Victor's smirk deepened. "Back down or someone dies." The words carried weight. Victor wasn't bluffing. Daniel's jaw tightened. His mind raced. He had no clear shot, no immediate way to disarm Victor without putting someone at risk. The wrong move could turn this into a bloodbath. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax. This wasn't over. He just had to wait. "That's better," Victor murmured. "Smart man." A tense silence stretched between them. The rain outside pounded harder, lightning flashing through the windows. Victor turned to his men. "Get what we came for, we're leaving." The robbers scrambled, stuffing valuables into their bags. Daniel didn't move. He had bought them time, but now the criminals were adjusting. They were preparing to escape, and that meant he needed to be ready. Because this wasn't ending here. Not yet. The air inside La Fortaleza was thick with tension. The robbers moved quickly, stuffing cash and valuables into their bags. Victor remained near the entrance, his gun still raised, his eyes never leaving Daniel. Daniel could feel it. Victor was re-evaluating him. The earlier scuffle had changed the dynamic. He was no longer just another hostage. He was a variable, a threat. "Let's wrap this up," Victor commanded. The stocky man, still sore from his takedown, glared at Daniel as he wiped blood from his lip. "Should just kill him now." Victor's smirk was thin. "And risk wasting more time?" He shook his head. "No, we're leaving." Daniel remained motionless, his thoughts racing. If they left, there would be no guarantee they wouldn't harm someone on the way out. They had come in expecting an easy job. Now, with their authority shaken, they might lash out. Victor glanced at the hostages. "We need leverage." Daniel stiffened. The nervous robber nodded quickly. "Yeah, we should take someone, in case things go south." Victor's gaze swept the room before settling on Miguel. Daniel's stomach twisted. "You," Victor said, gesturing with his gun. Miguel's face drained of color. Me? Victor nodded. "You're coming with us. You're our insurance." Miguel took an unsteady step back, panic flaring in his eyes. "Please, Daniel moved before he could think. "Take me instead." The words left his mouth with quiet finality. Victor raised an eyebrow. "You volunteering?" Daniel kept his voice level. "I'm worth more than him." Victor studied him, intrigued. "You think so?" Daniel held his gaze. "You already know I'm not just a chef." A pause. "You're curious." Victor chuckled softly. "Maybe I am." Daniel's muscles remained tense. He needed to keep control of the conversation, make himself valuable enough to distract Victor from Miguel. The leader tilted his head. "You're offering yourself up to save him? Admirable." He sighed as if considering. Then his smirk widened. "But no." Daniel's chest tightened. Victor turned back to Miguel. "You, move." Miguel hesitated, his breathing unsteady. The nervous robber grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. Daniel took a single step. The stocky man raised his gun immediately. "Try it and you're dead." Daniel froze. Victor tisked. "I was starting to like you, chef. Don't make me change my mind." Miguel shot Daniel a desperate look as he was pulled toward the door. Daniel's jaw clenched. This was bad. He had to act, but the situation was too volatile. Any sudden move, and Miguel would be the first casualty. Victor motioned to his men. "Time to go." The criminals moved toward the exit, keeping their weapons high. The rain outside was relentless, washing over the pavement like a curtain. Daniel felt his heart hammering, not from fear, but from calculation. They were almost gone. He had one chance left. His fingers curled slightly. Now or never. The rain poured outside, hammering the pavement in thick sheets. The robbers moved toward the door, their shadows stretching across the floor under the flickering neon open sign. Miguel's panicked breaths were the only sound inside La Fortaleza, aside from the distant rumble of thunder. He stumbled slightly as the nervous robber dragged him forward, his grip tight, his gun trembling. Daniel stood still, his entire body coiled like a spring. His mind was a machine, running calculations faster than his pulse. Think. The door was meters away. Once they stepped outside, his window to act would slam shut. He had to do something now. Victor, still at the front, turned slightly, his sharp eyes flickering toward Daniel. "You want him back?" he asked casually. "Come find me." The words hit harder than any bullet. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. Victor had turned it into something personal. Daniel's hands clenched. Victor smirked. "Until next time, chef." He motioned for his men to move. "Now." Daniel exhaled sharply and dropped low, sweeping his foot in a fast, precise motion. The stocky robber standing guard barely had time to react before his legs were taken out from under him. His gun flew from his grasp, clattering against the floor. Chaos erupted. Miguel yelped as the nervous robber jerked him forward, but Daniel was already moving. He surged toward them, ignoring the stocky man's groan as he hit the ground hard. Miguel twisted in the robber's grasp, panicked, but Daniel's next strike was quick and brutal, a sharp elbow to the wrist. The gun discharged into the ceiling. Screams rang out. Miguel collapsed backward as the robber reeled, his grip loosening for just a second, long enough for Daniel to grab his wrist, twist it hard, and wrench the gun away. Another shot went off, this time toward the floor. Victor turned fast, eyes flashing with something between surprise and amusement. "Oh, you really don't like being told what to do, huh?" Daniel ignored him, flipping the gun in his grip, leveling it at the stunned robber who had just lost his weapon. The man raised his hands instantly, stepping back. Victor exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Impressive, but you're still outnumbered." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to, because Victor was wrong. The power had shifted. The stocky man was still groaning on the floor. The nervous robber was disarmed. The one Miguel had knocked into the bar wasn't getting up anytime soon. That left only Victor. The leader seemed to realize it at the same time Daniel did. The room was silent now. A low hum of tension buzzed between them. Victor's smirk returned. "All right, chef, you've proven your point." He tilted his head. "Now what?" Daniel didn't move. The gun in his hands was steady, trained on Victor, but he wasn't a killer. He had left that part of his life behind. Victor knew it. "You're not going to shoot me," he said, his voice almost teasing. "I can see it in your eyes. You're a fighter, not an executioner." Daniel didn't reply. Victor took a slow step forward. Daniel's grip on the gun didn't waver. "Don't." Victor stopped, tilting his head slightly. "You really think this is over?" Daniel remained silent. Victor's smirk widened. "Then you don't know me at all." A sudden crash came from outside. Tires screeched against wet pavement. Headlights flared through the restaurant's window. Another car, backup. Daniel's stomach clenched, more of them. Victor grinned. "You didn't really think I'd walk into something like this without a plan B, did you?" Outside, car doors slammed. Footsteps. Daniel inhaled slowly. The final fight was coming, and he was ready. The pounding rain outside wasn't enough to drown out the sound of approaching footsteps. Daniel's grip on the gun remained firm, his mind racing. Victor smirked, unfazed by the shift in momentum. "You've been impressive, Chef," he said, voice calm despite the situation. "But this is where it ends." Outside, car doors slammed shut. Shadows moved beyond the rain-streaked windows. Daniel counted at least 3 figures approaching. More men, more weapons. Miguel clutched the bar behind him, eyes darting between Daniel and the entrance. "Daniel," he breathed. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have time for fear. He had to think. Victor rolled his shoulders, stretching his neck. "Here's what's gonna happen," he continued. "You're gonna put that gun down. My guys are gonna come in and we're gonna walk out of here, no problem." Daniel didn't blink. "And if I don't?" Victor's smirk widened. "Then we see how many bullets you have before they get to you." The tension was suffocating. The rain kept falling. Then the front door burst open. 3 men rushed inside, soaked from the downpour, armed, ready. Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired. The first shot wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to control. The bullet hit the floor just inches from the first man's foot, causing him to stumble. The moment of hesitation was all Daniel needed. He moved. With a swift motion, he flipped the gun in his grip, using it as a blunt weapon instead of a firearm. The second man raised his weapon, but Daniel was already on him. A sharp strike to the wrist sent the gun spinning across the floor. The third man lunged. Daniel pivoted, using his attacker's momentum against him. He ducked low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The gun clattered against the tile as the thug hit the ground hard. Victor had barely moved, watching it all unfold with amusement. "You really are something else," he muttered. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders. The 3 newcomers were groaning on the floor. The remaining robbers inside were already defeated. Now it was just Victor. The leader sighed. "Guess I'll have to handle this myself." Daniel squared his stance. Victor tossed his gun aside. "No more bullets," he said, "just you and me." Daniel knew what this was. A man like Victor didn't just rely on weapons. He was a fighter. He wanted control. And now he wanted to prove himself. "Fine." Daniel didn't hesitate. He struck first. A sharp jab. Fast, controlled. Victor dodged, stepping back smoothly. Then he countered. A vicious hook aimed at Daniel's ribs. Daniel absorbed the hit, twisting with it to minimize the impact. Then he retaliated. A brutal elbow to Victor's side. The leader grunted, but didn't fall. Instead, he grinned. "That all you got?" Daniel didn't respond, he simply moved. The fight was raw, precise. Victor was good, strong, trained. But Daniel was better. He had spent years in combat, perfecting his technique. Victor was a street brawler. Daniel was a soldier. Victor swung again. This time, a powerful right hook. Daniel ducked, stepped in, and drove his knee into Victor's stomach. Victor staggered, gasping. Daniel didn't let him recover. A sharp strike to the throat, a controlled hit. Not enough to kill, but enough to incapacitate. Victor collapsed to his knees, coughing violently. The restaurant was silent. Miguel, the hostages, even the remaining robbers, they all watched in stunned disbelief. Daniel exhaled, stepping back. "Stay down," he said quietly. Victor, still gasping for air, chuckled hoarsely. You should have killed me." Daniel didn't flinch. "That's not who I am." Sirens wailed in the distance. Miguel let out a shaky breath. "Police," he whispered. Victor cursed under his breath, tilting his head up at Daniel one last time. "This isn't over." Daniel met his gaze. "Yes, it is." The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed outside. Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe. It was over. For now. The distant wail of sirens echoed through the rain-soaked streets, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights flickered through the restaurant's windows, flashing across the soaked pavement outside. Inside La Fortaleza, time seemed frozen. Victor knelt on the floor, still catching his breath, his eyes locked onto Daniel. The once smug leader now looked different, his arrogance dimmed, replaced by something darker, but he wasn't finished. "You should have put me down," Victor muttered, his voice rough from the strike to his throat. Daniel didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, his stance solid, controlled. The fight was over, or at least it should have been. Then Victor moved. In a single, fluid motion, he lunged. Daniel reacted instantly. Victor wasn't reaching for a gun. He was going for something else, a blade. The glint of steel flashed under the dim lights. Daniel barely had time to dodge, shifting his weight just as Victor's knife sliced through the air where his ribs had been a second earlier. The crowd gasped. Miguel tensed behind the counter, his fingers gripping the edge. The remaining robbers were frozen, unsure whether to intervene or run. Victor pivoted, slashing again. This time Daniel blocked, his forearm catching the inside of Victor's wrist. The impact was sharp, bone against bone. Victor hissed in frustration, then Daniel countered. A fast, brutal strike, a knee to Victor's stomach. The force sent the leader stumbling backward, but he didn't go down. Daniel's mind raced. Victor was injured, but still dangerous. The knife made this fight unpredictable. "Let's end this," Victor spat, adjusting his grip on the weapon. "One last round, chef." Daniel exhaled slowly. No more holding back. Victor lunged again, knife aiming for Daniel's side. This time Daniel didn't just dodge, he stepped into the attack. His left hand snapped forward, trapping Victor's wrist. His right hand followed, a sharp, precise palm strike straight to the elbow joint. A sickening crack. Victor roared in pain as the knife slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. His arm dangled uselessly at his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Daniel didn't let up. With one final motion, he grabbed Victor by the collar, spun him around and slammed him onto the nearest table. The wood groaned under the impact. Silence. The fight was done. Victor lay sprawled across the table, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His arm was bent at an unnatural angle, his strength completely drained. Daniel took a step back, his breathing steady. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. It was over. The sirens outside had reached their peak. The red and blue lights painted the walls, and within seconds the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Miguel let out a shuddering breath, his entire body trembling. "Daniel!" Daniel glanced at him, then at the terrified customers still huddled in corners. The weight of the moment settled over him. The nightmare was ending. But one last problem remained. Victor wasn't just going to prison. He was going to remember this night. And Daniel knew, deep in his gut, this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. As the doors burst open and armed officers stormed inside, Daniel exhaled slowly. The immediate battle was won. But the war, that was just beginning. The restaurant's front doors burst open, sending a gust of cold night air rushing inside. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the chaos, broken tables, shattered glass, and criminals sprawled across the floor. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Armed officers flooded in, their weapons raised, moving with practiced efficiency. The remaining robbers immediately surrendered, dropping their weapons, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of real authority. Victor, still slumped over the table, chuckled weakly. His face was twisted in pain, but the glint in his eyes hadn't faded. Daniel stood back, watching as officers restrained the criminals, zip-tying their hands behind their backs. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a firm expression, approached Daniel. "You the owner?" Daniel shook his head. "Chef." The officer's eyes flickered over the scene. "Hell of a job for a chef." Daniel didn't respond. What was there to say? Miguel, still shaken, stepped forward. "He saved us," he said, voice unsteady. "If it weren't for him, we'd all be—" The officer held up a hand. "We'll need statements from everyone." He turned to Daniel. "You too." Daniel nodded but remained focused on Victor. The leader was being lifted to his feet, his injured arm hanging limply. Even in defeat, Victor's smirk remained. "Guess you won this round," he muttered, his voice low enough that only Daniel could hear. Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's over." Victor's smile widened. "For now." The officers led him away, his laughter fading into the storm outside. Daniel exhaled slowly. The weight of the night settled onto his shoulders, exhaustion creeping in. The adrenaline that had fueled him was wearing off, leaving only the dull ache of tension in his muscles. Miguel placed a hesitant hand on his shoulder. Daniel. Daniel turned. The younger man looked at him differently now. Not just as a chef, not just as a mentor, but as something more. How did you... Daniel glanced around the restaurant, the destruction evident in every corner. He had fought to keep violence out of his life, to build something new, but tonight had proven that the past wasn't so easily erased. He sighed. I did what had to be done. Miguel studied him for a moment before nodding. You saved my life. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't do it for thanks. He didn't even know why he had done it, only that something inside him refused to stand by while innocent people suffered. The officer returned, pulling out a small notepad. We'll need you to come down to the station. Standard procedure. Daniel nodded. He expected as much. As he followed the officer toward the exit, he cast one last look around La Fortaleza. The restaurant had survived. The people were safe. But something inside him told him this wasn't the last time trouble would come knocking. And when it did, he'd be ready. Because no matter how much he tried to escape his past, it wasn't done with him yet. The storm had passed, but the night still carried its weight. La Fortaleza stood in eerie silence, the scent of rain mixing with the lingering tension in the air. The restaurant would recover, the tables could be fixed, the glass swept away. But for Daniel, some things weren't so easily repaired. Seated inside the police station, he answered every question with calm precision. The officers took notes, exchanging glances as they processed what had happened. They weren't sure what to make of him, a chef who fought like a soldier, who disarmed criminals with practiced ease. Miguel waited outside, his knee bouncing anxiously. When Daniel finally stepped out, Miguel exhaled in relief. You're free to go. Daniel nodded. For now. Miguel hesitated. So, what happens next? Daniel didn't have an answer. The restaurant had survived, the people were safe, but Victor's final words echoed in his mind. For now. He knew this wasn't over. Miguel looked at him with quiet admiration. You're a hero, you know. Daniel shook his head. I'm just a man who did what had to be done. Miguel frowned. Then why does it feel like you're expecting another fight? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the dark streets beyond the station. He had spent years running from his past, believing he could build a life away from violence. But tonight had proven a brutal truth. Some battles find you, no matter how far you run. And if they did, Daniel Costa would be ready, because this was just the beginning.